The Sultan's golden throne sat atop a mountain of silk, but at its foot lay a box of dirt that smelled of wet graves and burnt rye. Bayezid I, the Thunderbolt, whose shadow stretched from the Silk Road to the Danube, watched as a single Wallachian rider, unarmed, mud-streaked, and smiling with blood-flecked teeth, stood before the Janissary blades. The tribute was not the promised 10,000 ducats, but a handful of Wallachian soil and a note from Prince Mircea stating that if the Sultan wanted the land, he would have to swallow it one mouthful at a time. In that silent, shimmering tent, the invincible Ottoman Empire was not challenged by an army, but by a mockery so profound it turned the Sultan's divine right into a joke whispered by his own guards. The air in the Ottoman pavilion was thick with the scent of ambergris and the underlying metallic tang of sharpened steel. Sultan Bayezid I, known to his subjects and enemies alike as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, did not move. To move was to acknowledge the insult. To speak was to give the messenger's breath value. Instead, he stared at the wooden box. It was a crude thing, made of rough-hewn oak, standing in stark contrast to the intricate mosaics and Persian carpets that lined the command tent. The messenger, a man named Danesti, who had ridden 3 horses to death to reach the Sultan's camp at Nicopolis, did not kneel. His leather jerkin was stained with the salt of sweat and the gray dust of the plains. He looked less like a diplomat and more like a ghost that had crawled out of the Danubian silt. My master, Mircea, voivode of Wallachia and prince of Amlash and Fagarash, Danesti began, his voice raspy but steady, sends his regrets. The gold you requested has been repurposed. It has been melted down to shoe the horses that will trample your camps. He sends this instead, the only part of our province you will ever truly possess. A ripple of hushed fury moved through the ranks of the Janissaries. These were the Sultan's elite, men who had seen the Byzantine walls crumble and the Serbian lords executed. To hear a petty prince of a marsh-ridden borderland speak through a common rider with such insolence was a breach of the natural order. One officer, his hand whitening on the hilt of his kilage, stepped forward, but a sharp, infinitesimal gesture from Bayezid stopped him. Bayezid finally stood. He was a man built of iron and ego, his eyes dark pits that had surveyed a dozen conquered kingdoms. He walked toward the box, his silk robes hissing against the rugs. He reached down, plunging his ringed fingers into the dark, damp earth. He brought a handful to his nose. It smelled of rot. It smelled of the stubborn, unyielding spirit of a land that refused to be tamed. Mircea thinks himself a jester, Bayezid said, his voice a low, terrifying silk. He thinks that the Danube is wide and the forests are thick, that he is safe from the Thunderbolt. He forgets that thunder follows the light, and the light burns everything it touches. The Sultan turned his hand over, letting the Wallachian soil spill onto his pristine carpets. Tell your master this. I will not just take his gold. I will take his sons. I will take his churches and turn them into stables. And when I am finished, I will sow his fields with salt, so that not even this wretched weeds will grow again. He has chosen a war of humiliation. I will give him a war of extinction.
Danesti didn't flinch. He expected you to say as much, Great Sultan. He also told me to tell you that the crows in the Carpathians are hungry this year. They have grown tired of deer. They crave the taste of Anatolian silk. The execution was swift but not silent. Bayezid signaled, and the Janissaries moved with practiced, lethal grace. As the blade fell, Danesti's eyes remained fixed on the Sultan, a haunting look of pity that bothered Bayezid more than the messenger's defiance. As the body was dragged away, leaving a dark streak across the pavilion, the Sultan's Grand Vizier, Ali Pasha, stepped out from the shadows. It is a provocation, my lord. He wants us to move before the spring rains cease. He wants us caught in the mud. Then we shall turn the mud into a road of bone, Bayezid replied, his rage finally breaking through the mask of imperial calm. Mobilize the Sipahis, summon the vassals from Rumelia. I want 60,000 men on the march by dawn. We do not negotiate with shadows, we hunt them. While the Ottoman war machine began to groan into motion, a terrifying assembly of horsemen, archers, and engineers, hundreds of miles to the north, Mircea the Old stood on the battlements of his fortress at Argesh. He was not a young man, but his frame was cast in the mold of the old Roman frontier. His hair was the color of iron, and his eyes were the color of the river under a storm cloud. Beside him stood his young grandson, Vlad, a boy who watched the horizon with an intensity that bordered on the feral. The boy would one day be the father of the man the world called Dracula, but for now he was merely a student of survival. "Did he take the bait, grandfather?" the boy asked. Mircea looked down the valley below. Already the plumes of smoke were rising, not from the enemy, but from his own orders. His soldiers were moving through the villages, instructing the peasants to gather what they could and flee to the mountains. The rest, the granaries, the haystacks, the cottages, were being put to the torch. "The Sultan is a man of pride, Vlad. Pride is a heavy armor. It makes a man strong, but it makes him slow, and it makes him predictable. He is coming for us with the fire of 1,000 suns, thinking he is the hunter." Mircea placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "But he does not realize that we have turned his kingdom into a graveyard before he has even crossed the river. To defeat a giant, you do not strike his head. You starve his belly and weary his feet. Tonight, we burn our homes. Tomorrow, we steal his sleep." As the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Carpathians, the horizon of Wallachia turned a bruised orange. It was the color of a land preparing to die so that it might live. The Great War had begun, not with a clash of shields, but with the calculated insult of a man who knew that the greatest weapon against an empire was not a sword, but the refusal to be afraid.
The scent of Wallachia was no longer the fragrance of blooming linden trees or the musk of the riverbed. It was the suffocating stench of a dying hearth. By the order of Mircea, the principality had been turned into a wasteland of ash. As the sun climbed over the eastern plains, it revealed a landscape devoid of life. The wells were choked with animal carcasses and bitter lye. The granaries were black skeletons of timber, and the very grass had been shorn and burned until the earth was a scorched, cracked skin. It was a silent, desolate greeting for the most powerful army on earth. Mircea the Old sat atop his dappled gray stallion on a ridge overlooking the Danube. Behind him, the remnants of his cavalry, the Viteji, waited in a silence so profound it felt like a held breath. These were not the gilded knights of the West. They were men of leather, fur, and iron, their faces hardened by a lifetime of border skirmishes. To their left, the dark mass of the forests beckoned, a labyrinth of oak and hornbeam that they knew like the veins on their own hands. "They have crossed," a scout reported, his horse lathered in foam. "The Sultan's bridge of boats at Nicopolis held. The Janissaries are on our soil, sire. They bring wagons enough to carry the world's gold, but no fodder for their beasts." Mircea nodded, his gaze fixed on the shimmering heat haze of the horizon. Bayezid moves with the weight of an empire. He expects a city to surrender, a king to kneel, and a feast to be laid. Give him nothing but the wind and the dust of his own footsteps. The strategy was a gamble of agonizing proportions. To save the soul of the nation, Mircea was tearing the flesh from its bones. Thousands of peasants had been herded into the deep mountain fastnesses of the Carpathians, leaving behind only the ghosts of their labor. It was a psychological blow that Mircea knew would grate on the Sultan's nerves more than any arrow. A conqueror needs something to conquer. Standing in an empty field, a conqueror is merely a wanderer. 10 miles to the south, the Ottoman vanguard reached the first village, a hamlet called Vedea. The Akinji, the Sultan's light cavalry, known for their speed and brutality, rode into the square with scimitars drawn, expecting screams and the frantic scramble of looters. Instead, they found a circle of scorched earth. The well had been filled with stones and the bodies of diseased swine. Not a single grain of wheat remained in the silos. Even the icons in the small wooden church had been stripped of their silver and the building left as a charred husk. By mid-afternoon, the main body of the Ottoman army arrived. It was a terrifying spectacle of color and steel, the green banners of the Prophet, the red standards of the Sultan, and the gleaming bronze of the Sipahi breastplates. But the atmosphere was grim. The horses, already weary from the river crossing, found no grazing. The heat was oppressive, and the dust kicked up by 60,000 boots turned the air into a gritty paste that coated tongues and throats. Sultan Bayezid rode at the center of his palatial train, his face a mask of simmering fury. He looked at the blackened fields and saw not a retreat, but a personal insult. Where is the king of the Christians hiding? Does he think he can starve the Thunderbolt? I have enough supplies in my train to last a month. The logistics are strained, my lord, Ali Pasha replied cautiously, gesturing to the endless line of wagons. The heat is drying the streams. If we do not find fresh water and forage within 3 days, the camels will begin to fail. The men are already complaining of the taste of the well water.
Then we march faster, Bayezid snapped. Mircea thinks these forests are his shield. I will turn them into his coffin. Find me a trail. Find me a man who knows these woods, and I will weigh him in gold. The man who knew the woods was already being sought, but not by the Ottomans. In a hidden encampment deep within the Vlasia forest, Mircea was dealing with a different kind of rot. Inside a tent lit by a single tallow candle, Mircea faced Boyar Dumitru, one of the wealthiest landowners in the southern counties. Dumitru's face was pale, his eyes darting toward the tent flap. You ask too much of us, Voivod, Dumitru hissed. My estates at Girju are gone, my cattle slaughtered by my own serfs on your command. The Sultan offers terms, tribute, but autonomy. If we continue this desert policy, there will be no Wallachia left to rule. Mircea stepped into the circle of light. He was a head taller than the boyar, and the scars on his hands told stories of battles fought, while Dumitru was still counting coins. You speak of estates as if they are the land itself, Mircea said, his voice a low vibration. The land is the people, and the blood they spill for it. The Sultan offers you a golden chain, Dumitru. I offer you a grave in free soil. Which do you find more comfortable? The other boyars are talking, Mircea, Dumitru warned, his voice trembling. They see the Ottoman banners, and they see a master who can actually provide protection. You provide only smoke. Mircea moved with a speed that belied his age. He gripped Dumitru by the throat, pinning him against the central tent pole. Outside, the sound of wetting stones against steel provided a rhythmic, lethal backdrop. Listen to the sound of the knives, Dumitru, Mircea whispered into the man's ear. Those are for the Turks, but they work just as well on traitors. If I hear one more word of terms or tribute from your mouth, I will hang you from the last unburnt tree in this county. Do you understand? Dumitru gasped, nodding frantically. Mircea released him, turning back to the map spread across the table. It was a map of the marshes near Rovine, a place where the earth was neither solid nor liquid. The Sultan is thirsty, Mircea said to his commanders, ignoring the shaking boyar. He is tired and he is angry. That is when a man makes mistakes. He will look for the shortest route to the capital. He will look for the road that seems the most direct. He pointed to a narrow bottleneck where the forest met the wetlands. We will not meet him in the open. We will wait until he is hip-deep in the mire, where his horses are useless and his numbers mean nothing. We will make the earth itself swallow the Thunderbolt. As night fell, the first Ottoman foraging parties disappeared into the woods. They were found the next morning, not by their comrades, but by the sight of their horses returning to camp, riderless and branded with the mark of the Wallach raven. The psychological war was beginning to take its toll.
The invincible army was starting to jump at shadows. Mircea stood in the dark, watching the distant glow of the Ottoman campfires. He knew the hardest part was yet to come. To defeat Bayezid, he had to remain a ghost, a king of ashes, until the moment he became a demon.
The moon over the Argesh River was a jaundiced sliver, casting long, skeletal shadows across the courtyard of the voivode's secondary stronghold. Within the cold stone walls, the air tasted of old damp and the iron tang of hidden daggers. Mircea the Old stood by a narrow arrow slit, watching the distant, flickering orange glow of the Ottoman advance. They were closer now, close enough that a man with a keen ear could almost hear the low, rhythmic thrum of the Turkish drums. But the danger inside the walls was currently far more lethal than the steel beyond them. In the center of the dark hall, a heavy iron chest sat open, its lid yawning like a hungry mouth. Inside were not ducats, but letters, parchments sealed with the wax of the Ottoman Porte. "The price of a soul has dropped, it seems," Mircea murmured, his voice echoing in the rafters. "Once it cost 30 pieces of silver. Now it seems a few promises of land and a title under a sultan's shadow are enough." Standing across from him was Boyar Dumitru, his face obscured by the gloom, but his hands betrayed him. They were twitching at his sides, plucking at the fine embroidery of his tunic. Beside him stood 3 other lords of the High Council, men who had grown fat on the peace Mircea had spent decades forging. They were the peace party, a euphemism for those who preferred a comfortable cage to a scorched battlefield. "It is not betrayal, voivode," Dumitru said, his voice cracking. "It is stewardship. Look at what you have done. The villages are cinders, the livestock are rotting in the rivers. If we continue this madness, there will be no Wallachia left to rule. We are merely negotiating a future where our people don't starve in the mountains while you play at being a hero." Mircea turned from the window, his movement slow and predatory. "A future? You speak of a future as the Sultan's tax collectors? You think Bayezid rewards those who hand over their kings? He uses them until they are hollowed out, then he discards them like the rinds of a squeezed lemon. The Sultan has promised us the southern counties as autonomous fiefs," another boyar added, his voice emboldened by Dumitru's presence. "He only wants your head, Mircea. Why should the whole nation burn for one man's pride?" The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the crown. Mircea walked toward them, his boots thudding rhythmically on the flagstones. He stopped inches from Dumitru, the scent of the man's nervous sweat clashing with the smell of the pine resin burning in the wall sconces. "My pride?" Mircea asked softly. "You think I burned my own granaries out of pride? I did it because I know the Turk. I know that if he finds food, he stays. If he finds shelter, he builds. If he finds a willing servant, he creates a slave. You aren't worried about the people, Dumitru. You are worried about your counting houses in Georgiou. You are worried that your gold is melting in the fires I started." Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the hall burst open. Vlad, Mircea's grandson, staggered in, his face bruised and his tunic torn. Behind him, 2 of Mircea's loyal Viteji guards held a struggling man in Ottoman silks, a messenger caught in the secret tunnels beneath the fortress.
"They were going to open the postern gate tonight, grandfather," Vlad gasped, pointing at Dumitru. "They have already sent word to the Ottoman vanguard. The Sultan's Akinji are less than 2 miles away, hidden in the ravine." The betrayal was no longer a matter of politics. It was a matter of survival. The boyars recoiled, their faces turning a ghostly white in the flickering torchlight. Dumitru reached for a concealed knife, but Mircea was faster. The prince's hand clamped onto Dumitru's wrist with the strength of a smith's vice, twisting until the blade clattered to the floor. "You would give my grandson to the Janissaries?" Mircea's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a low roar. "You would sell the blood of your own kin to save your silks?" "The Sultan's light is inevitable," Dumitru screamed, his composure finally shattering. "You are an old man fighting a god. We chose the winning side." There is no winning side for a traitor, Mircea replied. He didn't execute them on the spot. That would be too clean, too merciful for the stakes they had gambled with. He looked to his captain of the guard. Bind them, not with rope, but with the Ottoman chains they so dearly desired. Take them to the edge of the marshes. If they love the Sultan's shadow so much, they shall be the first to greet his vanguard. As the guards dragged the screaming boyars away, Mircea turned to his grandson. The boy was trembling, not from fear, but from the raw, cold realization of what leadership required. "Watch them, Vlad," Mircea said, his eyes hardening. "This is the rot that kills more kingdoms than the sword. Remember their faces. A man who will sell his neighbor will eventually sell his soul. In this land, loyalty is the only currency that doesn't lose its value when the fires start." But the damage was done. The signal had likely already been received. Outside, the sound of a distant horn echoed through the valley, the high, piercing wail of the Ottoman Boru. The vanguard was moving. "They are coming for the gate," Vlad whispered. "Let them come," Mircea said, drawing his broadsword. The steel caught the light, a cold blue flash in the darkness. "He think they are entering a fortress of traitors. They will find instead a slaughterhouse of shadows." Mircea moved to the battlements. The plan had shifted. He could no longer wait for the marshes of Rovine to do all the work. He had to blood the Sultan's nose here, in the cradle of the hills, to prove that even with betrayal, Wallachia was not a carcass to be picked over. He looked out to the dark tree line. He knew Bayezid was there, watching, waiting for the gate to swing wide. The Sultan expected a handoff. He would receive a hurricane. "Archers to the southern wall," Mircea commanded, his voice carrying over the ramparts. "Douse the torches. Let the darkness be our shield. We do not fire until they are close enough to smell their own fear." As the first Ottoman riders emerged from the shadows of the ravine, thinking the way was clear, they saw the postern gate stand ajar. They let out a cry of triumph, spurring their horses forward. But as they crossed the threshold, the gate didn't just open, it collapsed in a deadfall of sharpened logs and burning pitch. From the silence of the walls, 1,000 bowstrings snapped in unison. The massacre was surgical. The narrow approach became a bottleneck of screaming horses and dying men. Mircea stood above it all, a silhouette against the rising moon, watching the Ottoman pride bleed into the dry earth. The betrayal had failed, but the war had reached a new feverish pitch. The Sultan would not forgive this humiliation. The grandfather of Dracula had held his house, but the roof was now truly on fire.
The marshes of Rovine did not belong to the world of men. They belonged to the frogs, the leeches, and the ancient rotting spirits of the silt. It was a landscape of deceptive stillness, where the emerald moss masked a bottomless hunger, and the mist clung to the lungs like a wet shroud. Here, the Danube's tributaries bled into a labyrinth of reeds and stagnant pools, creating a bottleneck that Mircea had spent his entire life studying. He knew that to a horseman of the steppes, this place was a nightmare, but to a defender of the soil, it was a cathedral of bone. Mircea the Old stood ankle-deep in the black mire, his armor blackened with soot to kill the glint of the sun. Around him, 3,000 of his finest archers lay hidden in the high sedge, their breathing synchronized with the rustle of the wind. They had spent days constructing a series of submerged causeways, paths of sunken timber known only to the locals. To the approaching Ottoman eyes, the valley looked like a flat, traversable plain. In reality, it was a series of lethal trenches disguised by the overgrowth. "The Thunderbolt approaches," whispered a scout, emerging from the reeds like a swamp wraith. "Bayezid has lost his patience. He leads the center himself. He has abandoned the supply wagons to make speed. He wants your head on a pike before the sun sets." "Good," Mircea replied, his voice a low rasp.
A man in a hurry does not look at his feet. Tell the men, do not let a single arrow fly until the Janissaries are past the first dike. I want the water to turn red before they even see a Wallachian face. The sound of the Ottoman approach was a physical force. The rhythmic thud of thousands of boots and the jingle of harness steel vibrated through the mud. Then came the music, the jarring, cacophonous blare of the Mehter war band, designed to shatter the nerves of the enemy. From the tree line emerged the vanguard, 5,000 Sipahis on armored stallions, their lances tipped with horsehair plumes, followed by the iron-disciplined ranks of the Janissaries. At the center of the host, Bayezid I rode a white charger that looked like a ghost against the dark backdrop of the forest. He looked at the marshy expanse and saw only a minor inconvenience, a final stretch of soggy ground, before he could crush the king of the shadows. He raised his hand, and the order to charge was signaled by a thunderous roll of drums. The Sipahis surged forward. For the first 100 yards, the ground held. But as the weight of 5,000 armored horses hit the throat, the illusion shattered. The earth didn't just give way, it disintegrated. The leading horses plunged chest-deep into the hidden bogs, their legs snapping like dry twigs as they hit the underwater trenches. The momentum of the charging rear ranks pushed the front line deeper into the mire, creating a screaming, churning mass of man and beast. "Now," Mircea said, a single, devastating word. A horn blast rang out, and the dead marshes suddenly breathed fire. From the reeds, from the mud, and from the tops of the gnarled willow trees, a storm of arrows erupted. These were not the light shafts of the steppe, but heavy, broad-headed Wallachian arrows, designed to punch through plate armor and bone alike. The Ottomans were trapped in a killing box. To their left and right were impassable swamps. Behind them, their own infantry was pressing forward, unaware of the slaughter at the front. And before them was a wall of invisible death. "Close the circle," Mircea commanded, drawing his sword and stepping onto one of the secret timber paths. The Viteji rose from the muck like vengeful spirits. They didn't use lances, they used heavy maces and short-handled axes, weapons built for the claustrophobic brutality of a melee where there was no room to swing a sword. They fell upon the bogged-down Sipahis with a primal ferocity. It was no longer a battle, it was a harvest. Mircea moved through the carnage with a terrifying rhythmic efficiency. He saw an Ottoman officer struggling to free his leg from a fallen horse, and with a single downward stroke ended the man's war. The prince's eyes were fixed on the white charger in the distance. He wanted the Sultan to see the face of the man who had turned his divine army into a feast for the crows. Bayezid, seeing his elite cavalry being methodically dismantled, did the unthinkable. Instead of retreating, his pride flared into a reckless brilliance. He ordered his Janissary archers to fire into the melee. "But my lord," Ali Pasha cried, "our own men are in the middle." "Our men are already dead," Bayezid roared, his face contorted. "Kill the Wallachians, clear the path with their blood." A black cloud of Ottoman arrows whistled into the swamp, striking friend and foe indiscriminately. The Sipahis, already drowning in the mud, were now being executed by their own sultan. The sheer cold-bloodedness of the move gave the Ottomans a momentary opening. The Janissary infantry, stepping over the corpses of their comrades, began to form a bridge of bodies. They pushed forward with a fanatical desperation, their scimitars flashing in the dimming light. Mircea felt the tide beginning to shift. The weight of numbers was starting to tell. For every Janissary his men cut down, 3 more seemed to rise from the blood-stained water. "Sire, we must fall back to the second line," his captain shouted, parrying a blow from a Turkish mace. "They are using their own dead as dry ground." Mircea looked at the carnage. He had humiliated the Sultan, had broken the invincibility of the Thunderbolt, but he was losing the war of attrition. He caught sight of Vlad, his grandson, defending a narrow bridge, the boy's face splattered with the gore of a man twice his size. A sudden realization struck Mircea. He didn't need to win the battle today, he needed to break the Sultan's soul. "Retreat!" Mircea bellowed, the signal echoing through the reeds. The Wallachians vanished into the mist as quickly as they had appeared, melting back into the terrain they knew so well. The Ottomans, exhausted and decimated, did not pursue.
They stood on the edge of the marshes, surrounded by the bodies of 10,000 of their brothers, staring into a fog that seemed to laugh at them. Bayezid, standing on the gore-slicked earth, his white horse now stained a dull, rusted red. He had taken the field of Ravine, but as he looked at the shattered remains of his army, he knew it was the most expensive victory in the history of the House of Osman. Mircea, watching from the safety of the dark forest, wiped his blade on a patch of moss. The first act of the tragedy was over. The Sultan was on Wallachian soil, but the soil was starting to swallow him whole.
The Ottoman camp was a city of canvas and misery, sprawling across the plains of Wallachia like a festering wound. Despite their technical victory at Rovine, the morale of the Sultan's host was fraying. Dysentery had begun to whisper through the ranks of the infantry, and the horses were dying of a mysterious lethargy, the result of the toxic lye Mircea's men had dumped into the upstream tributaries. But for Sultan Bayezid, the physical loss was secondary to the symbolic one. He had come to crush a peasant prince. He had found a phantom who turned the very water into poison. "He is out there," Bayezid hissed, pacing the length of his pavilion, watching us, laughing in the dark. The Sultan's eyes were fixed on the center of his camp, where the alem, the imperial standard, stood. It was a magnificent pole topped with a golden crescent and horsehair tails, the ultimate symbol of Ottoman sovereignty. To lose it was to lose the favor of God. It was guarded by a literal ring of fire and 100 of the Sultan's personal solak guards, who stood with drawn bows, forbidden to blink until the sun rose. 2 miles away, in the hollow of a lightning-scarred oak, Mircea the Old was not laughing. He was preparing a surgical strike that would strike deeper than any broadsword. "We do not go for the Sultan," Mircea whispered to his hand-picked squad of 20 viteji. Among them was young Vlad, his face smeared with grease and charcoal. "Bayezid is a god in his own mind. If we kill him now, he becomes a martyr, and his son will bring a fresh 100,000 to avenge him. But if we take his honor, if we take the standard, we turn the Thunderbolt into a flickering candle." The Wallachians moved like smoke. They did not wear mail, which would clink against the brush. They wore dark, boiled leather and carried short, curved knives and jars of a volatile naphtha mixture. They used the crawling method, a technique perfected in the border raids, moving only when the wind rustled the leaves, freezing into statues whenever the Ottoman sentries turned their heads. They entered the camp not through the perimeter, but through the drainage trenches the Ottoman engineers had dug. It was a foul, suffocating journey through knee-deep filth, but it bypasses the outer pickets. As they emerged near the stables, the stench of the dying horses masked their own scent. Signaled, 2 men broke off to sow chaos, slipping into the horse lines and slicing the tethers. They didn't kill the animals, they simply spooked them. Within minutes, a dozen panicked chargers were thundering through the camp, knocking over cook fires and trampling tents. "Fire!" a voice screamed in Turkish. The camp erupted. The Solak guards around the standard tightened their circle. Their eyes darted toward the burning tents near the perimeter. This was the midpoint reversal. As the elite guards looked outward, Mircea and his men rose from the shadows of the Sultan's own supply wagons, barely 30 paces from the golden crescent. "Now," Mircea commanded.
Vlad was the swiftest. The boy darted forward, low to the ground, sliding under the strike of a janissary's halberd. He reached the base of the standard and swung a heavy iron cleaver, biting deep into the seasoned wood of the pole. The Solaks turned, realizing too late that the threat was within the inner sanctum. A flurry of arrows hissed through the air. One caught Mircea in the shoulder, the iron tip glancing off his leather pauldron, but the old prince didn't flinch. He stepped into the light, his heavy mace crushing the helmet of the nearest guard. "Take it!" Mircea roared. The pole groaned and tilted. With a final, desperate heave, the Wallachians brought the imperial standard crashing to the mud. It was a sight that froze every Ottoman heart that saw it. The golden crescent, the symbol of an empire that stretched from the Balkans to the Euphrates, lay in the dirt, splattered with the muck of a Wallachian bog. "To the horses!" Mircea shouted. They didn't try to carry the heavy pole. Instead, Vlad sliced the silken banners and the horsehair tails from the wood, stuffing them into a leather sack. It was the trophy they needed. The escape was a blur of steel and fire. The Ottomans, paralyzed by the sacrilege they had witnessed, were slow to react. By the time Bayezid emerged from his tent, his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and disbelief, the intruders were gone. All that remained was the splintered stump of the standard and a single Wallachian arrow thrumming in the wood, a piece of scorched parchment tied to its shaft. Bayezid ripped the parchment away. It was a message written in his own court's elegant Persian script, a language Mircea had mastered years ago. A man who cannot keep his shadow from the mud should not seek to rule the sun. You are a guest in my house, Bayezid, and the bill is coming due. The Sultan's scream of rage was heard by every soldier in the camp. It was not the sound of a conqueror. It was the sound of a man who realized he was being played with. As Mircea and his men galloped back into the safety of the dark hills, the sun began to rise. Vlad looked at his grandfather, seeing the blood on his shoulder and the grim triumph in his eyes. "We humiliated him," Vlad said, clutching the bag containing the Sultan's silk banners. "We did more than that," Mircea replied, his voice heavy with the coming toll of the war. "We showed his men that he is mortal. But be warned, Vlad. A humiliated beast is more dangerous than a hungry one. He will stop at nothing now. He will march on Targovishte, and he will burn everything in his path to prove he still has the power of the Thunderbolt." The victory was sweet, but the cost was rising. The midpoint of the war had passed, and the trajectory was now set toward a final, bloody resolution.
The capital of Targovishte did not fall to a siege, it fell to a vacuum. When the Ottoman vanguard finally crested the last ridge of the Wallachian plain, they did not see the defiant banners of the house of Basarab. They saw a city that looked like a hollowed-out skull. The great gates stood wide, swinging on rusted hinges in the dry wind. The marketplaces were empty, the bells of the princely church were silent, and the only residents left were the stray dogs howling at the scent of the approaching storm. Sultan Bayezid entered the city not with the roar of a conqueror, but with the cautious, simmering suspicion of a man walking into a trap. He rode through the deserted streets, his horse's hooves clattering on the cobbles like hammers against a tomb. "Where are they?" Bayezid demanded, his voice echoing off the limestone walls. "Where is the gold? Where are the artisans? Where is the king?" Ali Pasha, his face drawn and sallow from the long march, gestured to the open doors of the princely palace. "Gone, my lord. The scouts report the entire population has moved into the Transylvanian Alps. They have taken the livestock, the grain, even the tapestries from the walls. They have left us a shell." Inside the throne room, the Sultan found the ultimate insult. In the center of the hall, perched upon the empty throne of Wallachia, sat a simple peasant's effigy made of straw and tattered wool. Around its neck hung the stolen Ottoman silk banners from the night raid, now stained with horse dung. At its feet was a single bowl of salt and a crust of moldy bread, the traditional greeting for a guest, twisted into a mocking gesture of poverty. Bayezid did not scream this time. The rage had transmuted into a cold, crystalline obsession. He sat on the floor, refusing the tainted throne, and spread his maps. "He thinks the mountains will save him," Bayezid said, his eyes tracing the jagged lines of the Carpathians. "He thinks the cold will turn me back. He forgets that I have taken the heights of Anatolia and the peaks of Bulgaria. We will not stay in this ghost city. We will hunt him in the crags. I want his head, Ali Pasha. I do not care if I have to pave the mountain passes with the bodies of my infantry to get it." While the Sultan occupied a city of ghosts, Mircea the Old was fighting a different war in the high passes of the Fagarash Mountains. The midpoint reversal had cost him his capital, and with it the confidence of the remaining boyars. In the cramped, freezing confines of a mountain cavern, Mircea sat before a small fire.
His shoulder wound from the night raid had begun to fester, the skin around it an angry, pulsing red. Vlad sat across from him, sharpening a hunting knife. "The men are whispering, grandfather," Vlad said, his voice low so the sentries wouldn't hear. "They say we have lost the heart of the country. They say that by retreating to the clouds, we have left the valleys to be raped by the Janissaries." Mircea looked at his grandson. The boy had grown thin, his eyes haunted by the things he had seen at Rovine. "The heart of a country is not its stone walls, Vlad. It is its will. If I had stayed in Turgoviste, Bayezid would have leveled it with his siege engines and slaughtered every soul within. By giving him the city, I have given him a burden. He must now feed his army in a place with no food. He must guard a city with no walls. He is no longer an invader. He is a prisoner of his own conquest." "But the cold is coming," Vlad countered. "Our people are dying in these caves. The infants and the old ones, they cannot eat will." It was the moral crisis Mircea had feared. To save the nation, he was presiding over the slow death of his people. He stood up, his joints popping, and walked to the mouth of the cave. Below them, the vast, dark expanse of the Wallachian forest stretched out like a sea. Somewhere in that darkness, the Sultan's campfires twinkled, a mocking reminder of the enemy's warmth. "Tomorrow," Mircea said, "we stop retreating. We have led the wolf into the deep woods. Now we remind him why the woods are dark." "What is the plan?" Vlad asked, standing beside him. "We do not fight them with steel anymore," Mircea replied, his eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. "We fight them with the mind. We will turn their hunger into madness. We will make every shadow a Wallachian and every sound a scream. If the Sultan wants these mountains, he shall have them, but he will find that the peaks are made of ice and the valleys are made of his own men's blood." Mircea turned back to the boy, his expression grimmer than Vlad had ever seen it. "Send word to the hidden cells in the lowlands. Tell them to begin the guerrilla of the mist. No more battles, no more standards, only the knife in the dark and the arrow from the trees. We will bleed the Thunderbolt drop by drop until he is too weak to hold his own lightning." As a blizzard began to howl through the pass, obscuring the path back to the world of men, Mircea the Old accepted his role as the king of shadows. He had lost his throne, but he was preparing to claim the Sultan's sanity.
The Ottoman army was no longer a conqueror. It was a shivering, starving beast trapped in a cage of wood and stone. Sultan Bayezid's dream of a swift mountain campaign had dissolved into a grueling reality of vertical slopes and freezing rains. For every mile the Janissaries marched into the Carpathians, they lost more men to the terrain than they did to the sword. But it was the silence of the forests that broke them first. Mircea's guerrilla of the mist had begun. It was a war of nerves, played out in the claustrophobic thickness of the pines. The Wallachians did not charge, they haunted. An Ottoman sentry would be standing by a fire, his hand hovering over the warmth, only to be pulled into the darkness by a silent noose. A foraging party would enter a clearing, find a table set with fresh bread, and die in agony minutes after eating the arsenic-laced dough. "They are not men," whispered a Sipahi to his comrade as they huddled in the lee of a jagged limestone cliff. "They are the Strigoi, the undead. My cousin saw one leap from a branch 40 feet high, throat a man, and vanish before the body hit the snow." Bayezid, ensconced in a tent reinforced with heavy furs, listened to the growing reports of desertion and madness. His thunderbolt was flickering. The supplies from the south were being intercepted by Mircea's light horsemen before they could even cross the foothills. The Sultan's men were eating their own saddle leather, boiling it in snow water to make a bitter, rubbery broth. "I will smoke them out," Bayezid roared at his council, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "If they hide in the trees, then the trees shall burn. Order the engineers to start fires at the base of the pass. We will turn the Carpathians into a furnace." "My lord," Ali Pasha countered, his voice trembling, "the wood is green and the air is damp. The fire will not spread. It will only create a smoke so thick our own men will wander off the cliffs. We must retreat to the plains before the first true blizzard seals the passes." Bayezid struck him. The blow was fueled by a month of humiliation. "I do not retreat. I am the shadow of God on earth. Mircea is a thief in the night, a peasant who hides in the dirt. I will stay here until I have his heart in my hand." But Mircea had a more visceral plan for the Sultan's resolve. That night, as a thick, cloying fog rolled down from the peaks, the Ottoman camp was subjected to a new kind of torture. From the darkness of the surrounding woods came a sound, a low rhythmic thumping, like 1,000 drums beating in time with a human heart. Then came the voices, thousands of Wallachian voices, chanting the names of the dead from the Battle of Rovine. They didn't attack, they simply sang. The songs were old, haunting dirges of the mountains, melodies that sounded like the wind through a graveyard. To the superstitious Anatolian soldiers, it was the sound of the earth itself demanding their souls. "Fire into the trees!" an officer screamed. The Ottomans unleashed volleys of arrows and musket fire into the mist. The lead and wood disappeared into the gray veil. No screams followed, no bodies fell. Only the singing continued, louder now, circling the camp until the soldiers were spinning in place, lashing out at shadows that weren't there.
In the midst of the chaos, Mircea and Vlad moved through the perimeter like predators in a sheepfold. They weren't there to kill the Sultan tonight. They were there to feed the fire of his paranoia. They slipped past a line of sleeping, exhausted guards and reached the Sultan's personal stable. Vlad pulled a small vial of pungent musk from his belt, a scent that would drive any stallion into a murderous frenzy. He smeared it on the Sultan's prized white charger. "The beast will do the work for us," Vlad whispered. As they withdrew, the stallion began to kick, its hooves splintering the wooden stall. Within minutes, the stable was a riot of panicked horses. In the confusion, the Wallachians set fire to the Sultan's remaining grain wagons. The morning light revealed a devastating scene. The Sultan's finest horse had kicked its way through 3 guards before breaking its own neck in a ravine. The last of the bread was ash, and nailed to the center pole of the Sultan's pavilion was a single bloody human ear, a grim reminder of the boyar Dumitru, the traitor the Sultan had expected to meet in the capital. Bayezid walked out into the cold, biting air. He looked at his army. They were hollow-eyed, their armor rusted, their spirits broken by a king of shadows they could not see. "He is inviting us to the final dance, Ali Pasha," Bayezid said, his voice strangely calm. It was the calm of a man who had finally accepted that he was in a duel to the death. "He wants me to follow him to the iron gates. He thinks that is where he will break me. And will you go, my lord?" Bayezid looked up at the towering, snow-capped peaks. "I have no choice. To turn back now is to tell the world that a Wallachian count is greater than the house of Osman. We march at midday. We go to the iron gates. If God wills it, we shall find him there. And if not, we shall find our graves." Mircea, watching from a high outcrop, saw the Ottoman columns begin to move deeper into the trap. He turned to Vlad, his face a mask of iron. "He is coming," Mircea said. "The Thunderbolt is spent. Now we show him the anvil." The air at the summit of the Transylvanian Alps was thin enough to bleed the spirit. Yet here, amidst the jagged teeth of the peaks, the fate of Christendom was being bartered for over a map of stained vellum. Mircea the Old stood in a small wind-whipped hunting lodge, the fire in the hearth failing to cut the chill of the mountain night. Across from him sat Sigismund of Luxembourg, King of Hungary and future Holy Roman Emperor, a man whose robes were too fine for the mud and whose eyes were too calculating for the battlefield.
You ask me to commit the finest knights of the West to a marshland in the middle of nowhere? Sigismund said, his fingers tracing the line of the Danube. Bayezid is a monster, Mircea. He has the momentum of a falling mountain. Why should I risk my crown to save your forest?
Mircea leaned forward, the firelight catching the deep, jagged scars on his hands. Because, Sigismund, the forest is the only thing standing between the Sultan's Thunderbolt and your palace in Buda. If Wallachia falls, the Danube becomes an Ottoman highway. You don't help me to save my people. You help me to ensure that the next time you see a janissary, he isn't drinking from your golden chalice. Sigismund looked out the window at the swirling snow. He knew Mircea was right. The reports of the Sultan's humiliation at Rovine and the loss of the imperial standard had reached the courts of Europe, turning Mircea into a legend, a man who had dared to pull the beard of the lion. The Pope calls for a crusade, Sigismund admitted, his voice lowering. The French and the Burgundians are eager for glory, but they are arrogant. They do not know the Turk as you do. Then let them follow me, Mircea said. I do not want your knights to lead. I want them to be the hammer. I have spent months turning the Sultan's pride into a blindfold. He is chasing me through the passes, thinking he is the hunter. By the time he reaches the iron gates, he will be starving, exhausted, and desperate for a victory. That is when you strike his flank. Mircea pulled a heavy iron seal from his tunic, the mark of the House of Basarab. I will sign your pact. I will acknowledge your suzerainty for the duration of the war, but in exchange I want the full weight of the Hungering heavy cavalry. I want the world to see that the Thunderbolt can be broken by the very land it tries to strike. Sigismund hesitated, then nodded. The pact was sealed, a secret alliance that would change the geometry of the war. But as Sigismund's retinue departed, Vlad stepped out from the shadows of the lodge, his face dark with skepticism. You sold our sovereignty to a king who would rather feast than fight? Vlad asked, his voice bitter. I bought us time, Vlad, Mircea replied, his gaze returning to the south. A pact is a piece of paper, a sword is a piece of steel. We use the king's greed to buy the Sultan's grave. In this world you must sometimes wear a chain to break a yoke. Meanwhile, miles below them, the Ottoman host had reached its breaking point. The retreat from the mountains had been more devastating than the advance. Sultan Bayezid, refusing to acknowledge the failure of his campaign, had ordered his men to march through the night. The result was a trail of frozen corpses and abandoned equipment that stretched for miles. Bayezid stood at the edge of the foothills, looking at the distant, shimmering line of the Danube. He was no longer the pristine emperor who had entered the country weeks ago. His eyes were sunken, his beard matted with grime, and his voice was a jagged rasp. He is there, Bayezid whispered, pointing toward the narrow gorge of the iron gates. I can feel him. He is waiting for the final act. He thinks he has humiliated me enough. The scouts report a massive movement of European knights to the west. Sigismund of Hungary has mobilized. If we stay here, we risk being caught between the Wallachian wolf and the Hungarian hound. Let them come, Bayezid roared, his madness finally taking a physical form. He drew his scimitar and struck the trunk of a nearby tree, the blade biting deep into the wood. I will turn the iron gates into a slaughterhouse. I will show this grandfather that I am the master of the world. We do not retreat to Nicopolis. We go to the gorge. We finish this. The stage was set. Mircea had his alliance, and the Sultan had his obsession. The two greatest tacticians of the age were now moving toward a narrow strip of land where the river ran deep and the cliffs rose like walls. It was a place where numbers would mean nothing, and where the humiliation of the Sultan would either be finalized or avenged in blood. Mircea turned to Vlad as they prepared to descend back into the fray. Remember this day, boy. This is how empires fall. Not because they are weak, but because they believe they are too strong to be fooled. The Sultan thinks he is chasing a man. He is actually chasing a ghost into a mirror.
As the first bells of the Crusaders began to chime in the distance, the Wallachian woods fell into an expectant, lethal silence. The climax was coming, and the iron gates were waiting to be shut.
The iron gates were not made of metal, but of the cold, indifferent limestone of the Carpathians, where the Danube narrowed into a churning, suffocating throat of white water and jagged rock. It was a place where the earth seemed to be trying to crush the river out of existence. Here, the arrogance of the Thunderbolt met the absolute stillness of the stone. Sultan Bayezid's army, now a bedraggled serpent of tired men and dying horses, spilled into the narrow gorge, blinded by the morning sun reflecting off the water. Mircea the Old stood on a natural stone pulpit 500 feet above the Ottoman vanguard. He did not look like a king. He looked like a part of the mountain itself, his gray cloak blending into the lichen-covered rock. Beside him, the heavy iron hammers of his engineers hung ready over the trigger pins of the deadfalls. "He is in the throat," Mircea whispered, his hand white-knuckled on the hilt of his sword. "The Janissaries have filled the pass from wall to wall. They are so crowded they cannot even draw their bows." Mircea watched as Bayezid's personal retinue, identified by the few remaining silk banners they had managed to salvage, entered the narrowest point of the gorge. The Sultan was pushing his men forward with the desperation of a gambler who had lost everything and was betting his very life on one final bloody toss of the dice. "Let the river speak first," Mircea commanded. At the signal, Wallachian soldiers upstream released the massive silt dams they had been building for weeks. A wall of debris, logs, and churning mud slammed into the Ottoman rearguard, cutting off the path of retreat and throwing the pack animals into a screaming frenzy. The sound was like a mountain collapsing. "Now," Mircea said, and he pulled the first lever himself. The iron gates screamed. Massive boulders, some the size of cottages, had been precariously balanced on the cliffs above. As the pins were pulled, they descended in a rhythmic, terrifying avalanche. They didn't just kill, they obliterated. The narrow path became a charnel house. The Janissaries, the pride of the Ottoman Empire, were crushed where they stood, unable to move forward through the debris or backward through the rising flood. "Archers!" Mircea roared. From the cracks in the cliffs, thousands of Wallachian bows sang in unison. Because the Ottomans were packed so tightly, every arrow found a home. It was not a battle, it was an execution. The Thunderbolt was trapped in a stone box, his lightning striking nothing but his own men. Bayezid, miraculously untouched by the falling rock, looked up and saw Mircea. The two men locked eyes across the chasm of dust and death. The Sultan raised his scimitar, a gesture of futile defiance, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the Danube. He saw his empire bleeding out in a gorge that didn't even have a name on his imperial maps. Suddenly, the blare of a different horn echoed from the western end of the pass. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of armored hooves announced the arrival of Sigismund's Hungarian knights. They appeared like a wall of polished steel, charging into the mouth of the gorge to meet the terrified Ottoman vanguard. Caught between the falling mountains and the charging iron of the west, the Ottoman army finally shattered. The discipline that had conquered the Balkans dissolved into a primal scramble for survival. Men threw down their weapons and leapt into the freezing, lethal currents of the Danube rather than face the rain of Wallachian arrows. "Grandfather, the Sultan is trying to break through," Vlad cried, pointing to a small group of Sipahis attempting to carve a path through the Hungarian line. "Let him try," Mircea said, his voice cold as the stone. "The humiliation is complete. He came to take my crown, he will leave without even his dignity." Mircea led his own Viteji down a hidden goat path, joining the melee on the floor of the gorge. The air was a thick soup of dust, blood, and the metallic scent of clashing steel. Mircea moved like a reaper, his heavy mace shattering the shields of those who dared stay and fight. He reached the Sultan's inner circle just as Sigismund's knights crashed into the other side. The Janissaries formed a desperate circle around Bayezid, their bodies a living wall.
They fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves, but they were being hammered into the earth. Mircea stepped forward, his mace dripping, and raised his hand. "Hold!" he bellowed, his voice carrying through the din. The fighting slowed as the Wallachians and Hungarians surrounded the last of the Ottoman elite. Bayezid stood in the center, his robes torn, his face smeared with the ash of his burned ambitions. He looked at Mircea, the man he had called a jester. "You have won the mud, Mircea," Bayezid spat, his pride still flickering like a dying coal. "But you cannot kill an empire." "I do not need to kill it, Bayezid," Mircea replied, stepping over a fallen standard. "I only needed to show you that you are a guest here, and guests who overstay their welcome are shown the door." Mircea leaned in close, his voice a low, terrifying growl that only the Sultan could hear. "Go back to your palaces. Tell your sons how the grandfather treated you. Tell them that for every inch of Wallachian soil you want, you must pay in the blood of 10,000 sons. This is the only tribute you will ever receive from me." In an act of supreme humiliation, Mircea did not take the Sultan prisoner. He did not execute him. He ordered his men to clear a path. He let the Thunderbolt walk out of the gorge, on foot, through the bodies of his own soldiers. As Bayezid stumbled away toward the south, a broken man trailing a broken army, Sigismund of Luxembourg rode up to Mircea. "You let him go?" Sigismund asked, incredulous. "We could have ended the Ottoman threat forever." "No," Mircea said, watching the retreating figure. "If I kill him, a stronger man takes his place. If I let him live with this shame, he will tear his own empire apart with his rage. A humiliated sultan is a poison that works from the inside." Mircea turned to Vlad, who was looking at the carnage with a grim, budding understanding. The boy would one day be known for his cruelty, but today he had learned the power of psychological ruin. The Battle of the Iron Gates was over. The legend of Mircea the Old was forged in the blood of 60,000 men, and the Ottoman tide had been turned back by the sheer unyielding weight of a land that refused to be owned. The war did not end with a grand ceremony. It ended with the scratch of a quill on a cold morning in 1417. Mircea the Old sat in his rebuilt hall in Târgoviște, the city no longer a ghost, but a bustling hive of defiance. The treaty lay before him, the peace of the brave. Wallachia would pay a symbolic tribute to keep the Sultan's pride intact, but no Ottoman soldier would ever set foot on its soil, and no mosque would rise where a church stood. Mircea looked at his hands, now gnarled with age and the ghosts of a dozen battles. He had kept his people free, but he had paid for it with the youth of his grandsons and the ashes of his forests. "They will come back, won't they?" Vlad asked, his face a mirror of Mircea's iron resolve. "Yes," Mircea said, signing the parchment. "They will come back, and when they do, they will remember the Iron Gates. They will remember that this land is not made of earth, but of the bones of those who died to keep it. You must be ready, Vlad. You must be the shadow that haunts them when I am gone." Mircea walked to the window, looking out at the Danube. The river flowed on, indifferent to the empires that rose and fell along its banks. He had humiliated the greatest conqueror of the age, not with a larger army, but with a deeper understanding of the soul. He was the grandfather of Dracula, but to his people, he was simply the old man who had taught the mountains to fight. As the sun set over the Carpathians, casting long, dark shadows across the plains, the legend of Mircea the Old was etched into the stone of the world, a reminder that even a thunderbolt can be broken by the earth it tries to strike.